Who lives in the place we call rural America? How do we know who lives there? And why do more and more people across the world live in urban instead of rural places? Answers to these questions are offered by the field of rural demography. Demography is the study of human populations. Population in this context means a collection of humans, such as all people who reside in rural communities, the focus of rural demography. Demography depends on a census of almost all members of that population. A census is the systematic enumeration and recording of information about a population. Demography, population, census. This was a lot of information for sentences. I don't blame you if you rewind the last 30 seconds to take note of these concepts. On the note of censuses, you might have heard about the ongoing 2020 census. It's a survey that the US Census Bureau conducts every 10 years to get an overview about who lives in America and where. After the Census Bureau has sent out surveys to all households in the US to submit demographic information, they have now sent out enumerators to interview people who have not yet filled out the survey. Reaching every resident in the US is a very expensive undertaking. This shows you how much value the government and demographers find in this information. If you haven't filled out the survey yet, you can still do it on the website of the Census Bureau. There's an important critique about demography related to collecting census data. We can only study demography in societies where a census can be conducted, which requires a highly developed bureaucracy and repressive means to mandate people to fill out a survey. Censuses are also primarily conducted for a state's management of its population. Not surprisingly, the first censuses in human history were conducted to assess a state's tax base. This is to say that demography is tied to state power. Another critique that is directed at demography is that its big data approach turns people and their doings into abstract objects. If you read demographic literature, you find that demographers talk about mortality instead of dying. They talk about childbearing years to denote the life of women between 15 years and the late 40s, and summarize a situation when more people are born in a place than die as natural increase. Some people find it alienating to be described in this way. The core concern of demographers are population and migration, but almost everything that sociology covers is studied by demographers, such as poverty, health, race, education. With rural demography, core concerns that set the subdiscipline apart are rural populations, the impacts of environmental changes on populations, and demographic concerns in developing countries related to issues such as nutrition, fertility, or migration. So what are some applications of rural demography? The most basic applications are descriptions of a population at a particular point in time. For example, you may ask, what is the rural population in America? Well, let's see. So this is the public user interface of the Census Bureau, where you can access all kinds of data. Let's see, total population, decennial census. That's what we want. Okay, so this is interesting. This is the total population of the US at the last census. 308,745,538 people lived in the United States at the last census. Now, this doesn't tell us anything about urban and rural, so we need to keep looking. So here it says urban rural, so this looks good. It does have a separation between urban and rural, but the number looks kind of low. Remember last time we had something with like 308 million for the population, and now it's only 131 million. So there has to be something wrong here. Oh, okay, I see. So here you see the universe is actually housing units and not people. So the universe means the whole population that is looked at here. And here the population isn't people, but actually housing units. So that might be interesting for some, but not what we're looking at. So let's keep looking. Let's check out this one. Total, yeah, so here, universe is the total population, so this looks good. Right, here's our 308 million people, and then it's broken down here into urban and rural people, and this is the number that we are looking at, 59,492,267. That is how many percent of the US population? Get your calculator out or your phone and figure it out. Pause here until you find the solution. The correct answer is 19.269 or 19.27%. How did I figure this out? So I took the rural population of 59,492,267 and divided it by the total population, which is 308,745,538. And now we need to multiply the whole thing by 100 because we're looking at percent and not just a fraction. So times 100 gives us 19.269 or 19.27. All right, this is how you do it. In the weekly assignment, I'll ask you to calculate the share of the rural population of Pennsylvania in percent. So if you wanted to check the rural population of any given state, we can do so by clicking here on Customize Table and then adding states to this geography selection here. So state, and there we go. And let's just use New Jersey, for example, because I know we have some students here from New Jersey. And then, yeah, right. So here you see it broken down into rural and urban people in New Jersey. And you can do the same procedure to find out the rural population of Pennsylvania. I promise there won't be much more math in this class. It's just to show you how you can answer simple demographic questions for yourself using the data interface of the US Census and some simple math. Okay, now let's assume you're interested in something more specific. How about some basic data about State College? Okay, let's type in State College, Pennsylvania. That comes already. Let's see what we get. Well, see, there's an overview right here. It has the population, median household income, poverty rate, employment rate, and all kinds of different information. This is what you'll have to do for the demographic profile of your community, which is coming up in a few weeks. You might want to bookmark these instructions. So this is what statisticians call descriptive statistics, a summary of your data. I assigned you a short section from Chapter 8 in Schaft and Brown, in which they demonstrate an example of such a descriptive analysis, looking at the racial distribution in rural America. But being sociologists, demographers want to find out more than that. They're more interested in how certain variables relate to each other, like does rural residents affect educational attainment, or how demographic characteristics change over time or across space. In short, they're interested in social theory and making predictions. I assigned you the report Rural America at a Glance of the Economic Research Service of the USDA that presents 6 demographic trends in rural America of the last decade. I won't go into detail here, but ask you to review this report yourself to get a taste of what rural demography looks like in practice. One demographic issue that I do want to discuss is urbanization, which Brown and Schaft address in the second chapter of their book. Urbanization is a process through which an area or population becomes more urban over time. For example, according to the United Nations, the global urban population increased from 0.7 to 3.9 billion people between 1950 and 2014. A staggering increase. In the United States, we've seen urbanization too over that time, although not as dramatically. But this is not because urbanization isn't a strong trend here. It's because it happened earlier, in the 19th and early 20th century. Remember, last week we discussed that rural sociology addresses the interplay between rural and urban places. Looking at urbanization is central to understanding this relationship. I ask you to read Brown and Schaft's chapter on urbanization as they describe it in more detail and with more data that I can present in this lecture. What I want to do here is to sketch out the main trajectory of urbanization. Until the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, the global population was relatively constant, Of course, there was migration which increased the population in some countries, like in the United States. But the natural increase, the sum of births and deaths, was very low. People had lots of kids, but they were losing lots of kids too. That changed when agriculture became industrialized. Through the use of new machines and steam power, the productivity of agriculture increased drastically. Now, the nutrition of children and mothers improved, famines became less frequent and more people survived. But the increase in productivity also meant that less labor was needed. The result was more people with fewer jobs. So where did they go? To the cities. Steam power allowed manufacturing to become more efficient if organized in factories, which tended to be concentrated in urban areas. Factories needed workers, and their owners happily employed rural people desperate for any kind of income. Urbanization set in motion. Now, sociologists are adamant that urbanization is not just the result of new technology. It also required social reorganization. Brown and Schaft refer to Charles Tilly, who showed that urbanization was driven by two other innovations of the 18th century, capitalism and the nation-state. Put differently, urbanization is not a natural process but man-made, or rather elite-made. As we'll see in a few weeks, rural people did not voluntarily give up their land so machines could take their place. Instead, they were driven out by force, so investors could make a profit in agriculture, which required access to land. Agronomists today find that agriculture can increase its productivity through smart, labor-intensive production systems, referred to as agroecological, which apply ecological principles to farming. Imagine if the productivity increases in agriculture over the last centuries were not achieved by technology, chemicals, and fossil energy, but agroecological methods and more labor. How would history have turned out differently? People would not have to move anywhere, because they would have jobs in their communities. But if people farm their own land, you don't have any workers whose labor you can exploit in factories. So for the elites, there was no incentive to push labor-driven intensification. Instead, they focused on new technologies that displaced people in the countryside and provided jobs in the city. Of course, these jobs had one caveat. In the countryside, peasants owned collectively what they needed for their work and lives. In the cities, these means of production were owned by the capitalists on which the workers now depended for their livelihood. Now you may ask, to what extent does this apply to urbanization today? We still find that farms close because other farms get bigger, because new technologies and agrochemicals are more efficient on extensive fields. And when farms close, so do the businesses that support the farmers, forcing these people to find new livelihoods. So this hasn't changed. What did change is that new technology allows white-collar workers to telecommute from rural places, and a significant part of the population now has accumulated enough wealth to retire in the countryside. This led to multiple temporary reversals of urbanization over the last decades, meaning there have been years when the share of rural people in the United States increased. While this is good news for rural municipalities and their tax base, it is an open question whether these new opportunities are accessible for the formerly land-based working class. In developing countries, the trend towards urbanization is certainly unbroken. Alright, let's conclude. Whether we agree or disagree that urbanization results from capitalist development and displacement, underlying is an undisputable observation that goes at the core of rural sociology. If rural places shrink and urban places grow, this occurs because people move from the former to the latter. So to understand rural places, we have to look at their place in the national and international society and their relationship to urban places. Rural and urban places do not exist in isolation from each other. Alright, let's wrap up. Today we explored rural demography as a subdiscipline of rural sociology, which is concerned with the characteristics of rural populations. We talked through some critiques against demography, as well as some of its application. I ended by discussing urbanization as a central concern of both rural demography and rural sociology. Based on Charles Tilly's argument, I described urbanization as an outcome of technological innovation and social reorganization. This involved capitalist elites investing in agriculture and industrial development and dispossessing rural farmers who then needed to migrate to the cities to find employment. Although urbanization has slowed down and at times reversed in the past decades in the United States and other developed countries, the underlying principle of land-based jobs disappearing and rural working-class people having to make a living elsewhere seems to be ongoing. Before I let you go, let's think through the question of the week. Drawing from your experience in this week's reading, what do you think are the main drivers why rural people move to urban places today? As always, allow yourself some time to think through this question. I ask you to submit your response in the weekly quiz. And that's it for this week. Thanks for watching and see you in class.